next session, data standards and dataset. So please feel free to use Q&A controls for asking questions. And without further delay, I will introduce our first speaker, Frances Ding from UC Berkeley. And Frances will be presenting her work on facing an adult problem, new data sets for fair machine learning.
Hi, thanks for having me here. Today, I'm going to be discussing this work about the UCI adult dataset, which is widely used in studies of algorithmic fairness, give some reasons why we might consider retiring it, and present some new datasets that we're very excited about and hope will be of use to the community. And this is joint work with Moritz Hart, John Miller, Ludwig Schmidt, and we're all at UC Berkeley. Okay, so why are we interested in datasets? The keynote already discussed a lot of reasons why. Datasets are also central to the machine learning ecosystem. And in today's machine learning paradigm, we split data into training and test sets and use the held out test sets to evaluate and compare methods. But that's not the only thing datasets do. So datasets also formulate problems by specifying an objective and a universe that we want to perform well on. They organize communities, for example, how the ImageNet Challenge became a central way to benchmark progress on computer vision. And datasets also interface between communities, such as academia and industry, giving them a common language for model inputs, outputs, and performance. Now, I also want to give a brief overview of fairness in machine learning and the role datasets play there. So the study of fairness in machine learning is a very active research area. And as a brief overview, many works take the framework that applying machine learning in the real world involves collection of a data set, which is then used to train a machine learning model, which can output often a decision that then affects the world in some way. At each of these steps, there may be bias or disparities between groups of people, and many works in algorithmic fairness study interventions to get each stage to satisfy mathematical fairness criteria, which are intended to also track normative goals, such as anti-discrimination. So as this diagram suggests, the field has recognized the huge importance of datasets and many of the harms that are associated with data, including historical biases, under or overrepresentation, and privacy concerns. So many of these concerns have been raised for cognitive tasks like vision or NLP and led to the creation of new datasets. However, when it comes to tabular data, most papers involve just a few datasets, and chief among them, UCI adult. So what is this adult dataset? It's part of the UCI data repository, and we can see on the list of most popular datasets from UCI, the first is IRIS, which is a really old and really small data set from almost 100 years ago with only 150 total data points. And the second most popular, adult, is our focus today and is also somewhat dated. So the adult data set has about 48,000 rows, each representing a US adult, where each row has that person's age, occupation, a couple of other characteristics, and whether or not that person's income was greater than $50,000 in 1994. Now let's do a deep dive into the adult data set, including its strengths and weaknesses. From its website in the UCI repository, we know that it was extracted by Barry Becker and Ronnie Kohavi from the, quote, 1994 census database. So this doesn't exactly pin down the source of the data, as we will discuss more later. The prediction task, as I mentioned, is to determine whether a person makes over $50,000 a year. And to do this prediction, there are 14 features available listed here. So I want to highlight in particular the race and sex features, which are examples of what the fairness community calls sensitive or protected attributes. And the presence of these features has contributed to the wide use of UCI adult in algorithmic fairness work. From Google Scholar, we assembled a rough estimate, really a lower bound on the number of algorithmic fairness papers citing the adult dataset over time. And we see that as the FAIR ML literature has grown steadily over the past 5 years, so too have their citations of UCI adult. From our quick search, there are now over 300 FAIR ML papers that cite the adult dataset. So now I want to mention some of the good aspects of UCI adult. One good feature of the adult dataset is its origin in census data. So the Census Bureau has established survey and data collection standards, which arguably avoid some of the known issues with other ML datasets. First, the collection has a quality sampling frame that results in data that's actually representative of the United States. Second, surveyors are skilled and compensated, which is in contrast to some instances of crowdsourcing on Mechanical Turk and other platforms. And finally, the Census Bureau provides hundreds of pages of documentation detailing survey questions, how the survey responses were processed later, how there's privacy concerns, and so on. However, of course, there are also a number of issues with UCI adult. So overall, We are concerned about UCI adults' external validity. That is, how much we can expect conclusions drawn from UCI adult to transfer to other settings. One apparent issue is that UCI adult is over 25 years old. In 1994, Time magazine ran this cover about how new the internet was. And a lot has changed since then, including census encodings for race. For example, the category Asian Pacific Islander has been disaggregated, among other changes. Second, the adult dataset underutilizes the wealth of census data out there. Features such as state information are not included, and we will see that locality can be important to model. More subtly, the choice of $50,000 is worrying because it was and still is a high income cutoff, way above the median income in the US in 1994. In fact, it's the 76th percentile of individual income, the 88th percentile in the Black population, and the 89th percentile among women. What this means is that classifier accuracy is actually higher for individuals and minority groups, which is the opposite of one of the core concerns in fair machine learning, which severely calls into question UCI adults' external validity for algorithmic fairness. So this leads us to ask the following questions. Can we reconstruct UCI adult? And can we then create different versions of adult with different income thresholds and test whether this affects fairness conclusions? I mentioned earlier that the documentation for adult just mentions the 1994 census database. So to reconstruct it, we searched through different census data products. Although the Census Bureau is mostly known for the decennial census that aims to count every individual in the US, it also offers several high-quality data products, many of which are based on surveys sent out every year to a random sample of the population. These surveying efforts tend to have high response rates and collect much more detailed information compared to the decennial census. The data released publicly include aggregate statistics and tables, as well as microdata samples where each row represents a person. And this microdata is essential for creating an individual level data set. So now to our reconstruction of UCI adult. We checked each row of UCI adult against available census data, and we did find a match to the 1994 Current Population Survey Annual Social and Economic Supplement available at this link. We ran into some challenges finding these matches as attribute names were changed from the UCI adult documentation. Some listings for the native country column were set to unknown in the adult dataset, and we also couldn't find exact matches for the final weight column. But this column seems to be not an individual characteristic, but a weight to get the overall dataset to match US demographics more precisely, and more details can also be found in our paper. So more importantly, with our reconstruction, we have access to the raw income variable now, which we make available as part of a larger Python package that I'll discuss more later. We created different versions of adult with different income thresholds and found that the 50,000 threshold presents an incomplete picture of fairness conclusions. So here are the results for one of the most widely studied fairness metrics, demographic parity, which measures whether the probability of a positive prediction is equal across two groups. Here we're comparing men and women for the groups, and smaller violations are better. So ideally the violation would be at 0. We plot the most accurate standard model in blue, as well as 3 different methods to modify that model to enforce fairness according to demographic parity. We vary the income threshold from $0 to $70,000, and we see that the results are sensitive to the choice of threshold. With the original UCI adult dataset, we would only see the slice of the plot at the dashed line and not the whole curve. So other results based on the adult dataset might also be sensitive to the choice of threshold, and we make our reconstructed dataset available for other investigations. As I mentioned earlier, though, the adult dataset only uses a fraction of the census data available publicly. For the last part of this talk, I'm going to discuss new datasets that we hope will be interesting for the community. So what do we want out of new datasets? First, it would be great to have just more datasets rather than primarily relying on a dataset like adult. And we'd also like them to cover more types of prediction tasks. Second, we'd like to have test beds for whether methods transfer well between different settings, also called robustness to distribution shift. In particular, if methods don't transfer well, that's a big red flag for where and when it's appropriate to apply these methods to real-world decisions. We'd also like to have larger data sets with enough data to study intersectional groups that often get overlooked. So the good news is that the Census Bureau provides such a rich resource to create new data sets to get at these goals. And our work exposes more of these data products to ML benchmarking. we've released a Python package that wraps around census data at folktables.org. And using the other features that the census provides, we've created 5 new prediction problems that run easily out of the box on predicting income, employment, health coverage, travel time to work, and mobility. Our package also makes it easy to create other prediction problems for any variables you might be interested in. And one thing we're really excited about is the fact that we can separate the data for all 50 states across multiple years, so it's perfect for studying performance variation in different settings and the effect of distribution shift. Now I'm going to briefly go through 2 of our interesting empirical findings with these datasets, but I want to emphasize that we're just scratching the surface, and we hope that these datasets will be useful to the community for lots of new insights. One observation we found is that training a classifier to enforce a statistical notion of fairness in one state and applying that classifier to another state leads to results that vary a lot depending on the state. So we generated this plot here by training a classifier on California data to enforce demographic parity, and then evaluated the classifier on all 50 US states. So each dot here represents one state. And what we see is that on California data, the classifier does what's expected, and it makes demographic parity violation 0 on the start point. But for other states, we can't necessarily expect that. Fairness violations spread far from 0, and accuracy is also unpredictable. As an aside, running these kinds of experiments is easy with our package. Here's a code snippet showing how to get California data that can be directly used for training a model, for example, logistic regression from sklearn. Another interesting finding was that fairness criteria violations may be more stable over time than predictive accuracy. Here we trained a standard model and 3 methods modifying it to enforce the demographic parity fairness metric on data from 2014. Then we evaluated the classifiers on 2014 through 2018 data. And what's well known is that classifier accuracy degrades with distribution shift, which here is changing the year that the data comes from. And we see gradual decreases in accuracy in this plot. What was surprising to us was that in contrast to that picture, violations of demographic parity were actually stable over time for all of the classifiers. So those are 2 empirical observations we found pretty interesting that hopefully give a taste for the kinds of questions we can ask with these datasets. Before I wrap up, I want to quickly talk about the scope and limitations of our work. First, we envisioned that this is primarily used as a benchmark dataset to compare methods, but it doesn't replace other substantive investigations that rely on census data for data science in sociological, historical, economic, or other studies. Second, this is still US-centric data, and there's still a need in algorithmic fairness for datasets in international contexts. And on that note, we welcome contributions to folk tables, and some additions we'd love to see include international census data from the 102 countries represented in the IPUMS databases, which you can find at that link. So to conclude, today we discussed how the fairness community has recognized the importance of datasets, but the data and software ecosystem that the community relies on are still lagging. There's good news that the Census Bureau releases many data products that provide a rich resource for new datasets. And to make those resources available to the FAIR-ML community, we've released a new software package that provides easy access to census data products and several ready-to-use datasets at folktables.org. From these datasets, we can see that distribution shift and intra-dataset variation pose challenges for applying fair machine learning interventions to real-world decisions, and really echo the call for context-specific interventions and caution whenever trying to port one thing to another setting. Finally, we want to emphasize that there are many more questions to ask with these datasets, and we hope that it will be a useful resource to the community. Thank you very much.